Tonight, Minneapolis is no longer just a city. It is a test case for President Trump's immigration surge, a test case for federal power versus local authority. And now, because of viral video, a test case for whether Americans trust what they are being told. Here is the core problem for the White House. When people see video, they decide in seconds. When the government explains, it takes minutes, and it requires trust. And in this case, reporting based on multiple angles of bystander footage is raising a brutal question. Were agents already in control of the weapon before the fatal shots were fired? Tonight, we break this down in layers. First, what we know based on what has been publicly reported. Second, the political strategy behind President Trump's response. Third, the institutional fight, Congress, courts, and federalism. And finally, what this means for the 2026 election map. This is news analysis, not legal advice, not a verdict. The story is still developing, and details may change as investigations advance. But the politics is already moving fast, because Trump is not treating this like a local incident. He is treating it like a national battlefield. Here is what has been reported by major outlets. Minneapolis has become the epicenter of a sweeping federal immigration enforcement surge, a highly visible operation with heavy federal presence, repeated protests, and repeated clashes. In that context, there have been two separate fatal shootings of U.S. citizens this month connected to federal immigration enforcement actions in Minneapolis. One of the deaths identified in reporting is Renee Good, killed during an immigration raid earlier in the month. The other is Alex Preddy, a 37-year-old intensive care nurse, killed during a confrontation near protests over the federal operation. Now, the detail that changes the political temperature is the video analysis. Reporting based on multiple camera angles suggests that an agent can be seen removing a handgun from Preddy's waistband and walking away with it, shortly before another agent fires multiple rounds. It remains unclear whether the shooting officer knew the gun had been secured. The Department of Homeland Security's public account described the incident as officers being approached by an individual with a handgun and the use of force in response to what officials described as a threat. But that account is being challenged in the court of public opinion by what viewers believe they can see in the footage. So the core ingredients are all here. A massive federal operation in a blue city, 2 U.S. citizens dead, and footage that appears to complicate the official narrative. Now, President Trump's response is where this becomes a national political fight. Instead of stepping back, Trump stepped in. He argued that the operation was central to his political success and framed the deaths as the result of Democrat-ensued chaos. That phrase is not accidental. It is a framing weapon. Trump is trying to move the public from one question, did federal agents use excessive force, to a different question, why are Democrats letting chaos happen? This is classic Trump crisis politics. Shift the moral spotlight away from the federal state and onto local democratic governance. Turn a question about tactics into a question about order. Turn a potential liability into a loyalty test. And you can see the target audience, not the activists on the street, not the state officials preparing lawsuits. The audience is the swing voter watching a short clip on a phone and asking one simple question: who is in control? Trump is betting that even if the details are contested, the broader vibe can still be captured. A city in turmoil, federal agents under attack, a president who refuses to blink. To understand why Trump is so aggressive in his framing, you have to understand what he is protecting. Trump's strongest political identity is not policy detail. It is the promise of control. He is the order candidate, the border candidate, the I will do it myself candidate. So when an incident threatens to look like federal chaos, he cannot concede uncertainty easily, because uncertainty undermines the brand. In traditional politics, a president says, "We will investigate." In Trump politics, investigate can sound like, "We were wrong." And that is why his messaging tends to jump straight to blame and certainty. It's not only about this incident. It's about preventing the opposition from defining the entire crackdown as reckless or out of control. Trump's theory is simple. If the country is debating immigration and disorder, he wins. If the country is debating federal abuse and credibility, he bleeds. Here is where Minneapolis becomes uniquely dangerous for Trump, politically. Immigration enforcement is supposed to be Trump's strongest terrain. It unifies his coalition. Enforcement-first conservatives, cultural conservatives, and voters who interpret disorder as a threat. But this case has an unusual element. Pretty was reported to be legally armed. That matters because it collides with another pillar of the modern Republican identity: gun rights. If the public narrative hardens into a legally armed citizen was disarmed and then shot, even if that is not ultimately what investigators conclude, it creates a coalition fracture. Here's the tension. Trump's message says, trust the federal agents, trust the crackdown. But the gun rights instinct says, a legally armed citizen has rights, including at a protest. So Trump faces a split-screen problem. To hold his base, he must defend enforcement. To avoid bleeding the broader right, he must avoid sounding like the state can do anything to anyone, even to someone with legal standing and legal ownership. This is the wedge inside the wedge. Immigration is supposed to unify the right, but the combination of a citizen, a gun, and a disputed shooting can fracture it. Now let's talk about the narrative gap, because this is the heart of the story. When there is no video, officials control the first draft of reality. When there is video, citizens do. And the political question becomes, who do people believe? In this case, the video is not just evidence. It is an organizing tool. It has already escalated this from a local tragedy into a national storyline. And this is why Trump is fighting so hard to set the frame early. If the public locks in an interpretation, fair or not, it is extremely difficult to reverse. That's why you will hear a pattern in the administration's messaging. Emphasize threat, emphasize chaos, emphasize the risks faced by agents, and treat criticism as political theater. Trump cannot allow this story to become federal overreach. He needs it to become federal order confronting local disorder. Because overreach triggers suburban anxiety, order triggers suburban relief. And suburban voters, not just the base, decide whether a crackdown becomes a winning issue or a political boomerang. Now to Washington. Democrats in the Senate are signaling they will use the DHS funding fight as leverage. The message is no votes for Homeland Security funding unless there are significant changes to ICE and related enforcement bodies. And the calendar is unforgiving. A January 30 funding deadline puts a potential partial government shutdown on the table. This is where Trump's governing style meets a constitutional constraint. The executive branch can deploy agents, but Congress controls the money. So we now have a three-way conflict. The White House wants enforcement momentum. Democrats want accountability and constraints. And Republicans have to decide whether they want to own a shutdown over an issue that now includes dead American citizens and contested video footage. Here is the strategic dilemma for Trump. If Democrats block funding, Trump can say, they're defunding security. That is politically useful. It's a familiar message. But if public sympathy is shifting toward the victim and toward concerns about federal tactics, the defund line may not land the same way. Trump's best-case scenario is a clean binary fight. Enforcement versus chaos. But Minneapolis complicates the binary. It introduces questions about proportionality, process, and credibility. Now we get to the deeper architecture of the conflict: federalism. Minneapolis is in a Democratic-run state. That makes it a perfect stage for Trump's larger political strategy. Demonstrate that the federal government can impose control, even where local leaders disagree. This is not just enforcement, it is messaging. It is the optics of sovereignty. Trump wants the country to see a simple picture. The federal government is acting. Local Democrats are complaining. Protesters are resisting. And Trump is the one who will not retreat. Why? Because that picture creates a strong political contrast. It turns a policy dispute into a cultural dispute. It makes Democrats look like they are defending disorder, even if their argument is about legality and restraint. But this strategy has a hidden risk. If the federal presence becomes the source of escalation, local leaders can flip the narrative. They can claim the federal government imported chaos into the city, not the other way around. So the federalism fight is not abstract. It is a battle over causality. Who caused what and who is responsible for the consequences? Trump's framing assigns causality to Democrats. Democrats want causality to land on federal tactics, and that is why every new video clip matters so much. Now, one reason Trump pushes hard against investigation talk is that investigations turn into process stories. Process stories are the enemy of Trump's politics. Process is slow. Process is technical. Process is full of, we don't know yet. But Trump's political power comes from certainty, from speed, from a clean villain. And yet, legally, this story is almost guaranteed to become a process story because the central factual dispute is video-based and timeline-based. Who had control of the gun? When? Who knew? When? And what did each person reasonably perceive in that moment? Those are not emotional questions. They are forensic questions. And forensic questions have a way of surviving rhetoric. This matters because a legal process can do something that political messaging cannot. It can lock in facts. It can compel testimony. It can force contradictions into the public record. So from Trump's perspective, the legal system is not just accountability, it is risk. And that is why you should expect the White House to do two things at the same time. First, defend the agents and the mission rhetorically. Second, structure the flow of information carefully, because in a video-driven controversy, each new release can either stabilize the narrative or blow it up. Let's be blunt. The White House is facing an information discipline test. In high-trust eras, institutions can say, we're investigating. In low-trust eras, people assume that means we're hiding the ball. So Trump's team has to choose between two dangerous options. Option one, speak early, speak boldly. That satisfies the base and sets the frame fast. But if later facts contradict the early story, the credibility damage multiplies. Option two, speak cautiously, speak slowly. That may reduce future contradictions, but it creates a vacuum that opponents and viral clips will fill instantly. Trump almost always chooses option one, and the reason is simple. He would rather risk contradiction later than surrender narrative control now. This is what makes Minneapolis such a revealing story about Trump's presidency. It shows the trade he is willing to make between speed and precision. Now, how does this play electorally? Immigration is a turnout engine for Trump's coalition. It motivates, it polarizes, it simplifies. But incidents involving U.S. citizens and disputed shootings can turn immigration from a policy issue into a trust issue. And trust issues hit Trump in a very specific place: independents and soft partisans. Here is the campaign risk. The more Trump says, trust us, the more the audience asks, should we? If the footage is persuasive to the middle, Trump's defense of the operation could be reframed as indifference to due process. If the footage is ambiguous to the middle, Trump's attack on Democrats could be reframed as strength. The middle decides which story wins. And Republicans in competitive districts will feel this first, because they need the base, but they cannot survive only on the base. So watch for a very particular signal. Not what the loudest national voices say, watch what borderline Republicans say. If they start asking for clarity and accountability, it means they are hearing worry from the voters they cannot afford to lose. Let's map out the most likely paths forward. Scenario 1, de-escalation. The administration supports an aggressive but credible review process, releases more information, and adjusts operational posture in Minneapolis. This lowers temperature, reduces shutdown risk, and protects swing voters, but may frustrate the base that demands maximal force. Scenario 2, doubling down. More agents, tougher posture, harsher rhetoric. The White House treats criticism as proof the operation is necessary. This maximizes base energy, but increases the probability of more confrontations, and therefore more footage, more hearings, and more political volatility. Scenario 3, strategic pivot. Trump keeps the broader immigration message, but shifts the spotlight to a different battleground. Another city, another policy lever, another headline. Minneapolis remains a symbol, but the daily fight moves elsewhere. This is a classic attention management strategy. Win the week by changing the week. Which scenario is most consistent with Trump's track record? Doubling down is the default. Pivoting is the emergency exit. De-escalation tends to happen only when costs rise faster than benefits. Minneapolis is not just a headline. It's a stress test of federal authority, a stress test of political coalitions, and a stress test of credibility in the age of video. Trump wants this to be a story about Democrats and chaos. His opponents want it to be a story about federal overreach, and the public, especially the voters in the middle, will decide based on what they see, what they believe, and what happens next. If you want the next update, subscribe, because in the Trump era, the story isn't only what happened, it's who gets to define what happened.